How are you doing?
Mr. Hagan, we're going to start talking about metal mines now. First of all, how many mines, metal mines on the Fraser system that are subject to the MMER?
Okay, we have 7 mines that are operating and in the Fraser Basin, but just to clarify, the MMER only regulate those mines that are in commercial operation and are discharging above 50 cubic meter per day threshold. Those mines are the Huckleberry mine on the Thatcher Reach at the far west end of the Chaco Reservoir, and the Endako mine at Fraser Lake, the Gibraltar mine at McLeish Lake, just north of Williams Lake. Those are all large open pit operations. And a small gold mine, very small, 120 tons per day, Braylorn mine, is also an MMER mine. There are 3 operating mines that are not subject to the MMER because they don't have a discharge. That's the Highland Valley Copper Mine near Logan Lake, the Mount Poly Copper Open Pit near just south of Likely, and the QR mine on the Quesnel River. It's a small mine. I'm not sure if it's actually open right now, but they do plan to operate soon. Now there are also numerous operating mineral and placer operations, and I'm not sure if you want me to clarify that at all. There are 3 mines that are listed as metal mines in the PPR, and I wonder if I should just mention that those aren't metal mines according to us, or whether we can leave that.
Yeah, let's go to the PPR and deal with that. If you can turn to page 75, please, of the PPR. So first of all, paragraph 201 indicates that there's 6, but you've said there's 7 because you have added the Braylorn mill into the list?
Yes, add Braylorn to that list.
Okay, and Braylorn is located where?
Braylorn is located at Braylorn. It's just south of Goldbridge on the Bridge River system.
Okay, and what is mined at Braylorn?
Braylorn is an underground gold mine.
Right, and there's a similar correction that should be made at paragraph 265 on page 100. That should be 7. And you would say that there's 4 that are subject to the MMER, including
Braylorn is also subject to the MMER at this time.
Okay. And was there something else you wanted to correct about? You said that there were some mines listed as metal mines that you didn't agree with?
This is actually in reference to table 3-7, which is appended at the back of the PPR. In that table, there are a couple of mines mentioned as metal mines. One of them is Wing Dam, which is on Lightning Creek, downstream of Wells Barkerville. The other is Keithley Creek, north of Likely. Those are placer operations. We don't consider them mines.
Okay, just to be clear, you're talking perhaps about a technical report rather than the PPR, is that right?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm talking about table 3-7. It may well be the technical report because I haven't been able to find that table again. So
Yeah.
yes, you're
Okay.
probably correct on
Okay.
that. I also wanted to mention Craigmont is listed as a metal mine. It actually was a metal mine, a copper open pit mine that closed in 1983. And just to clarify, it's still in operation, reworking the tailings of that facility, but we do not consider it a mine. They're processing magnetite out of the tailings, but it's not a mine under the MMER.
Do any of the MMER mines that you've talked about, Gibraltar, Huckleberry, Endako, or Braylorn, do they drain effluent into rearing lakes, sockeye rearing lakes?
Rearing lakes? Yes, I believe Endako has discharges into creek that drain into the Francois Lake, and they also have discharges drain into the Endako River, which subsequently drains into Fraser Lake. And I'm not aware of those are rearing lakes, but they are downstream lakes from Endako.
And Highland Valley Copper, why is that not an MMER mine?
Highland Valley Copper is in a dry area and they have a water deficit, so all the water in their tailing pond is recycled to the mill. They don't have a discharge and they have not triggered themselves into the MMER.
Well, I understood that there was discharges into Witches Brook at Highland Copper. Is that not right?
I'm not familiar with that. It could be, no, I shouldn't speculate. So I'm not sure. Well, they have informed us that they do not have a discharge, and our inspectors have been on site and confirmed that to the best of my knowledge.
Are all the closed and abandoned mines in the Fraser River known to Environment Canada?
Short answer is probably not. There are a considerable number of closed and abandoned mines in the Fraser Basin. I am aware of 15 reasonably large closed operations, and I know that there are at least 12 more that are slightly smaller. I'm not sure how much detail you would like me to go in for that. Do you want me to discuss some of these larger closed operations?
Well, first I'd want to ask you if abandoned mines or mines that were closed prior to the MMER being brought in are subject to the MMER.
No, they're not. The MMER only applied to mines that are operating. So mines that were operating in 2002 were captured by the MMER.
And the conditions for a mine to be subject to the MMER is that you indicated the discharge amount, but they also have to discharge into waters frequented by fish. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And if a mine becomes subject to the MMER, for example, if at some point in its history it has effluent discharge of 50 cubic meters a day, is it then forevermore subject to the MMER, even if its discharge limit or discharge averages go down?
It is, yes. If a mine closes, it may apply for a recognized closed mine status, which gives the mine 3 years after they close to they continue their monitoring for 3 years and conduct one more EEM program. And at that time, they may be a recognized closed mine, then subject to the general prohibition of the Fisheries Act, Section 36(3), but no longer subject to the MMER.
Okay, so for any mines that are not subject to the MMER for whatever reason, because they were closed or abandoned before the regs came in, or because they go through a closing process under the regulation, how does Environment Canada become involved in dealing with discharges from those, if there are any discharges?
If there are any discharges from those closed mines, then, well, they are still subject to Section 36(3) of the Fisheries Act. And our inspectors may visit and sample there to see if there's a problem.
Okay. Now, the metal mining effluent regulations were modeled in large part on the pulp regulations we've just been discussing with Janice Boyd, right?
Yeah. Yes, that is correct. They are largely the same.
Okay, so perhaps you can simply tell us what the differences are between the two sets of regulations.
Well, the essential difference is probably that metal mining has a slightly different scheme for monitoring cycles. There's two aspects of that. One, the mines may be captured at any time, so they tend to be out of step with each other. Each mine will go through its phase on a 3-year cycle to determine if there are effects, and confirm the effects that they have found, or confirm that they don't find effects. If a mine does 2 cycles, 2 phases, and does not find or confirm effects on fish or benthos or fish survey parameters, then they may do their subsequent cycles in 6 years after that. However, if they do find effects and confirm effects, then they're triggered into an extent monitoring survey, which is on a 2-year cycle, and subsequent to that, an investigation of cause cycle, again on a 2-year timetable. So that's one major change. There are differences in the way the receiving environment effluent characterization is conducted and reported. There are some differences in the way the sublethal toxicity is reported, but the philosophy and the structure of the program is largely similar.
In the pulp regulation discussion, we heard about the investigation of solution stage. Is that something that is contained in the mining regulation?
As I'm aware at this point, we have not had that discussion yet, no.
All right, but the investigation of cause component is in the mining regs?
Yeah. Many metal mines now are moving into a third phase and a fourth phase, and investigation of cause is something that they will need to do. So we are providing guidance and working out a way for mines to know what to do about that.
Is there fish tissue sampling done under the mining regs?
Yes, a fish tissue survey is required if any mine has a detectable mercury in their effluent above a threshold. And if they do detect mercury in their effluent, then they're required to sample mercury in fish tissue in the environment.
Parameter monitoring, the actual parameters that are to be monitored are set out, and I think a document that might be easiest to show this is a document I'm going to come to a little bit later, but I'll introduce it now. And that's the summary review performance of metal mines, which is a very long document, and we've just included some excerpts relevant to the Fraser system. So if you can just turn to the very back of that excerpt. So you could turn to page 90, for example.
Which tab are you at?
Oh, it's on the screen. So tab.
Tab 10.
Oh, I'm sorry. Tab 10. Page 90 would be an example. Okay, if you can turn that so we can see it. The parameters that are set out in the column on the left, right down to, let's just stop at the rainbow trout line. So the parameters from the top, arsenic, I think that the top one is, I could be wrong, down to flow. Those are set out in the regulation as parameters to be measured in the effluent.
Okay, what we're looking at here, the parameter list on the left column is the list of deleterious substances from Schedule 4, and pH range and flow must be monitored weekly. The acute lethality test, the MMER has the same prohibition of acute lethality as the PPER does, so we have that. And daphneomanganese is required to be sampled.
Okay. How were those parameters determined? Do you know?
These parameters are actually the ones that were listed in the old MMLER. And before the MMER were, while the MMER were being developed prior to 2002, we had a process called the Aquament process, which was a review of parameters which were in the old MMLER. And the decision was made at that time to just incorporate the same parameters into the MMER.
Okay. So in terms of compliance, the mines are required to sample everything that's set out in the parameters list on the schedule set out in the regulation.
Yeah. The all mines are required to sample these parameters weekly. There are provisions in the regulations that if some of these are non-detect or at a very low level after a certain amount of sampling, 12 months or whatever the period would be for the parameter, the mine may reduce the frequency of monitoring for some of these.
And these parameters are set nationally, is that right? So these would be required for all mines in the country?
These are national level parameters, yeah.
Okay. And so they're not necessarily reflective of particular contaminants expected from an individual mine?
No, they're not. It's a national regulation, so these requirements are the same for all mines.
Okay. Can additional parameters be required by Environment Canada to be monitored at an individual mine?
Additional parameters are not required for individual mines because it's not specified in the regulation. We do have mechanisms where we may recommend that additional parameters be monitored and reported, but that's not a requirement, it's a recommendation.
Does Environment Canada work with the province on developing additional parameters for the sites that maybe part
Yes,
of the,
we do.
the
We
provincial
do.
system?
Yes, we do. We have the same local monitoring committee scheme with that Janet spoke of. We have that for metal mines, so the province, ourselves, and the mines, any stakeholders that may be involved can discuss which parameters should be part of the mine monitoring program so that all requirements are met.
Okay. And the monitoring results from these parameters that we see on the screen, those are reported through the RISS system, the same as the pulp results?
They are, yes.
Okay. And is the database treated the same way as we discussed with respect to pulp for enforcement purposes?
Yes, it is.
I should mark this document that we have in front of us as an exhibit. I'll come back to it, but given that we've spent some time on it, if we can have this marked, the summary review of performance of metal mines.
Exhibit 1032.
While you're at it, Ms. Baker, just on this table that you introduced, page 90, just all of the tables that are at least in this tab, I think all of them have NMR, which means no measurement required, with the exception of the table you introduced at page 90, which has, I think, ND or... I have
Yes, that will refer to the part of the requirements I mentioned where if a mine fulfills certain requirements, their measurements are very low, non-detect, for example, then they may go on to a reduced monitoring frequency. So instead of having to monitor every month or every week and report a monthly average, they may be monitoring quarterly. So during those months when they don't monitor because they've achieved a lower frequency of monitoring, we have that NMR, no measurement required, because they're on a reduced frequency.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this document that we've just marked as Exhibit 1032, is this published every year, this summary document?
This document is intended to be published every year. It's published out of our mine processing division in Ottawa, and their resources may limit whether they actually do publish it every year, but it's their document, so I know they do try to do that.
That's the intention.
That's the intention, yes.
Okay. And it's made public, this document is that right?
It's a public document, yes.
Okay. And if, I take it if a mine has agreed to do additional parameter monitoring on a recommendation from Environment Canada, that wouldn't actually show in this. This just sets out the national required parameters?
That is correct, yes. This document just shows the basic requirements of deleterious substance monitoring.
Okay. I'd like to move now to environmental effects monitoring for mines. And we've covered a few things already, so I won't need to deal with them. But one thing we talked about with pulp was the reference sites, so that to do an examination of effects, they would look at a reference site and then the exposed site and do a comparison. Is that the same for metal mines?
Yes, that is the same for metal mining. It is a key concept in EEM that we compare an exposed area to a reference area, and if there are differences between exposed and reference, that is our effect.
And are there we heard with the pulp that they look for an upstream and a downstream site. Is that a challenge for mines?
It is indeed a big challenge in many cases. The ideal situation would be a mine or a mill discharging into a river. You use the downstream of the diffuser as the exposed area and upstream as the reference area. But many mines, if they discharge to headwaters, creeks, there is no upstream. So it's a challenge to find appropriate reference areas in that case.
Has that affected any of the results that have been obtained under the program?
It may challenge the interpretation of the results, yes. If you are using a reference creek that is in a different watershed, for example, it's a challenge to filter out what might be habitat effects or habitat reasons to explain the effects. It may not. If you have a difference between a reference and exposed, is it the effluent or is it a habitat issue? So that is one question that we need to look at.
The effluent parameter monitoring is published in this national document. Is there Is there a similar publication of EEM results for individual mines?
Individual mines, as for pulp and paper, issue interpretive reports each cycle. So that data is in their individual interpretive reports.
And are those interpretive reports made available on a website or another public way that access can be made to those documents?
Those interpretive reports are not available electronically, but they are available in departmental library, for example.
And how often are those interpretive reports done? Every 3 years?
Well, as I explained, every 3 years for the first 2 phases, and then subsequent to that will possibly be every 2 years if the mine is triggered into an extent and magnitude survey or an investigation of cause survey.
Has there been any results to date from metal mines, interpretive reports for metal mines in the province that show significant impacts on fish from metal mine discharge? And I'm talking here about the Fraser River mines.
Okay, you're speaking specifically of Endako, Huckleberry, and Gibraltar that have conducted EEM programs. Gibraltar has not yet issued their first cycle interpretive report. I'm expecting that next month. So I could speak to Huckleberry and Gibraltar. And just to keep it short, the Huckleberry results through their first 2 surveys could not confirm that there were effects on fish or benthos in that in the area that they were sampling. So their third cycle will be they've changed their final discharge location. So their third cycle, which they will be doing this summer, will be to double check to see if there were not effects. Gibraltar, or rather Endako, have conducted 2 surveys, and they are finding effects on both benthos and fish, young of the year fish. They conducted a juvenile rainbow trout survey of their fish survey. Their general capsule summary of their effects on benthos, they're finding an enrichment effect. And in fish, they tend to be finding an inhibitory effect on rainbow trout, although that's in some respect. In other respects, it seems to be enrichment, and there's uncertainty there whether it is a habitat issue or perhaps a temperature issue, the water being a little bit warmer.
And what is an inhibitory effect?
An inhibitory effect would be depressed or lower enrichment or lower abundance or richness of benthic invertebrates, or in fish endpoints, slower growth, less condition, smaller size at age would be inhibitory.
And Braylorn was another MMER mine you indicated earlier. Has it just reopened or commenced operations? Why is there no reports for it yet?
Braylorn, I'm just wondering how what I can say about Braylorn. There's a little bit of a dispute there whether they actually are subject to the MMER at this point, and they have not submitted an interpretive report at this point.
But they have been in operation for some time?
They operated for a couple of years in the early 2000s, and then they closed, and now they've just reopened. I think poured their first gold bar just last month. So they've only just started under that particular round of commercial operation.
Similar to the pulp regulations, after the first cycle of the mining regulations, there was a review done of the first cycle reports. Is that right?
That's correct. Just as the pulp and paper regs have been reviewed each cycle to check to see what's working, what's not working, we did that with metal mining as well.
All right, and that is at tab 8. It's dated August 2007.
Yeah.
Is this the document?
Yes, this is the Metal Mining Environmental Effect Monitoring Review Team report.
Okay, I'll have that marked, please.
So we've got 1,033.
All right, and if I can just turn to the recommendations that were made. And these begin, or they're summarized in the executive summary, beginning at Roman numeral 4. I'm just going to ask you about a couple of these. There's many recommendations. Go to the next page, please. Recommendation number 11. Recommendation 11 indicates that this is reflecting what we had talked about earlier, that the site-specific variables are not presently recorded in RIS. Is that right?
Okay, I'm not as familiar with RIS as some of us are, but I know that the RIS system has been enhanced, updated over the last couple of cycles, and I believe they are including some of these further recommendation now.
Okay. Number 15, so the next page, recommendation 15, indicates that both electrical conductivity and selenium should be added to the list of required effluent and water quality variables. Has that been done?
Some of these recommendations require an amendment to the MMER, and I do know that the National EEM office is proceeding with this regulatory package, which would include recommendations such as recommendation 15.
So your understanding is that there's a proposal to amend the regulation to include both electrical conductivity and selenium as required parameters?
Yes.
Number 20 says that regional coordinators should verify that steps were taken by mines to ensure that method detection limits recommended in the guidance for sampling and analysis of metal mining effluents are attained when reporting results. What is this? What's the issue here, and what's been done about it?
Two comments about recommendation 20. One is that one of the things we noticed earlier on was that the method detection limits for mercury were not being met, or were pretty close to the actual detection limits. The detection limit was close to the threshold that we were using to monitor compliance. So we've recommended that that be made more stringent. And I also noticed that the recommended method detection limits in Schedule 3, I believe, column 4, may be revised. Some of them were incorrect, so we had to do a bookkeeping amendment to fix that.
As the status quo is considered unacceptable, Environment Canada should consider changes to sublethal toxicity testing within the EEM program. What is that about?
This was a reference to sublethal toxicity, and this was the one recommendation out of the 40 that was somewhat, I want to know, I could say controversial, but the metal mine EEM review team consisted of stakeholders from industry, from environmental groups, and from government agencies, and each of these stakeholders had different perspectives of what would be suitable in the program. So the one area of disagreement within that team was the sublethal toxicity. So we're still discussing that, and we're still working on what the move forward should be.
And what was considered, why does it say the status quo was considered unacceptable? What was unacceptable about it?
Well, I guess the essential thing to say would be mine operators, for example, would like to drop the fish test, whereas the environmental groups would support keeping it. So we had that kind of debate going on.
So for now, it stays in as it is.
For now, it's just status quo, but the options are being further assessed.
Tab 9 of the Commission's document list is a December 2007 National Assessment of Phase 1 data. How is this document different from the one we were just reviewing?
How does this document differ from the review team document? Okay, this is the national assessment, which is conducted by the National EEM office. It's analogous to the national assessment for pulp and paper that we discussed with Janice. There's only been one so far. The second one is it's complete in translation and should be issued very shortly. So this national assessment of Phase 1 data just looks at the data and comes up with a national overview of what the parameters are saying, what the monitoring has suggested the effects are from mining effluent.
Okay, I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit 1034.
BC mines part of this national assessment?
Yes, the Benthos data was included in the national assessment. But when this national assessment was done, a look at the data was taken to ensure that the data were comparable on a national basis. So fish tests in BC tended to be non-lethal juvenile fish surveys, and those kind of surveys are not included in the national assessment. So benthos, yes; fish, no, for BC.
So to the extent effects on fish are described in this report, do those have any relationship to BC, the status of fish in BC, if our data wasn't included in the report?
Well, the national assessment would indicate general trends at any event. So if you look at a site-specific result, it might be different even if the data had been included in the national assessment.
Has there been any subsequent study? I think you actually answered this already when you said this is the only one so far. So, never mind. In this document, it reports...
Yes, there is a second assessment. It is ready to be released very shortly.
Sorry, yeah. This report does indicate some effects on fish and on benthic invertebrates, and that's set out in the executive summary at Roman numeral 3. And I'll just, at the very last paragraph, it says that for fish, there were significant reductions in condition and relative liver size. And for benthic invertebrates, it shows significant reductions in density and taxon richness. So with respect to both those trends, is that something that has been seen on the mines in BC, in the Fraser system?
Yeah, this is the national scale conclusion. So if we look at these results, site-specifically in the Fraser system, the Huckleberry situation would not support that because they have tended to find effects there. In Daco's capsule results so far show both an inhibition and enrichment effects. So again, the national level conclusion will include results like that, but it won't necessarily explain exactly what's happening at that specific location. So in Daco differs a little bit.
And what about Gibraltar?
And Gibraltar has not issued their first EEM interpretive report yet, so I don't know what their results have found.
We heard from Ms. Boyd that she's the only EEM coordinator for pulp in BC. How many mining EEM coordinators are there?
Okay, we've got, well, I'm the Metal Mining Environmental Effect Monitoring Program Coordinator for British Columbia mines, but we do have a person in Yukon who covers the Yukon mines. He does the EEM coordinator for that, for Yukon.
Do you have any staff that work under you?
No.
Do you visit the mines yourself to see if they are complying or working within the regulation?
Yes, I do conduct site visits on occasion. The purpose of a site visit is to essentially become more familiar with the area, help to gain insights into what the results are, and also to observe the environmental consultants as they do their monitoring program. Different consultants may be doing things in different ways, so if you observe what they're doing, you have a better idea of how the results may be interpreted or gain some insight into different practices that way.
All right, and the document that we marked earlier as Exhibit 1032 sets out compliance rates across the country. Do you know what the rate of compliance is for mines in BC with MMER regs?
It's not really something that I follow closely, but my impression is that the BC mines are generally in compliance with most of the parameters, or if they're not, it's usually a relatively minor issue.
And what about reporting under the regulation? Are the mines generally compliant with sending in their data?
They are, yes.
Okay. Mr. Grace, you're an environmental impact biologist for the province. What are your responsibilities as an environmental impact biologist?
Well, there's two major parts to that job. One is to conduct my own monitoring programs, basically design them, conduct some of the monitoring, often with others to help, and tabulate and assess the data and write reports. probably what's more relevant to today is I also do a lot of impact assessment work that involves review of consultants' reports, both in under the Environmental Assessment Act, under permits, and other legislation, provincial legislation.
Right, and you had a comment that I deferred you to make, which related to Kamloops Lake and whether it was a rearing lake. What did you want to add there?
Sure. Janice and I are involved in a Thompson River Monitoring Partnership group over the last 7 years. And as part of that, we meet annually, and we have presentations from various people. A couple of years ago, we did have a presentation from a DFO research scientist who had done studies on Kamloops and Mabel Lakes that showed that there was some rearing of sockeye in Kamloops Lake.
Thank you. Now, permitting of mines and mills in BC is done under the Environment Management Act.
That is correct.
Okay, and we have a couple of permits just for reference purposes that I'd like to put in the record. And the first one is at tab 18, and this is a mill permit for Caribou Pulp and Paper. It's got the cover documents, and then the actual permit begins in a few pages.
1,035.
You recognize this permit, or you recognize it as a permit issued under the Environment Management Act?
Yes, that's a permit issued under the Environmental Management Act for Caribou Pulp and Paper located in Quesnel.
Thank you. And then I have also a permit for Gibraltar, which is a mine, and that's at tab 20. Should be the next, there we go. Sorry, Mr. Hill, you recognize this as a permit for the Gibraltar mine?
Yes, that's a effluent discharge permit for Gibraltar mine.
Okay, so we'll have that marked, please.
1,036.
All right, and turning first to the mill permit, so this permit sets out the discharge limits, or the discharge monitoring requirements, I should say, and that's at page 8 of 13 of the permit. So if you can probably move down 7 more pages on the screen, that should show us. Yeah. All right, so the permit sets out the exact parameters, or the frequency, I should say, monitoring. And the authorized discharges are set out at page 3. Same tab, but it's tab 18. And page 3 sets out the authorized discharges.
Is that 3 of 13?
Yeah. Oops, there we go. That's correct.
Sorry, I didn't catch your question.
This is sets out the authorized discharges under section 1.
Yes, the first section of permits generally set out the authorized discharges.
And then the monitoring frequency was the page I had referred to earlier, which is 8 of 12.
The monitoring frequencies, et cetera, would be in section 3 of the permit.
And then for Gibraltar, just to go there as well, the discharge limits are set out at page 2. Well, it starts at section 1 on page 1, but moves over the actual table of discharges is on page 2.
Yes, that section there, 113, pertains to specifically to the discharge of effluent to the Fraser River.
Okay. How are the conditions of the permit determined? So the different parameters that are authorized as discharges and the monitoring requirements, how are those determined? I'll set to Mr. Hill.
Well, generally speaking, the permit discharge parameters would that an applicant would apply for would be based on best available technology numbers that might come from guideline documents, for instance. Then there would be an assessment of whether or not they can attain the ambient guidelines. So, and then from that process, there may be a need to come up with lower numbers to ensure that ambient guidelines are met.
Mr. Grace, Mr. Hagan described the mines in the Fraser system that are subject to the MMER. Are there additional mines that you're aware of on the Fraser system? Not mines subject to the MMER, but just other mines?
Other mines. There are closed mines.
Okay.
I don't know of any other actively operating mines.
Okay, and Mr. Hagan also answered some questions about whether all the closed and abandoned mines in the Fraser River watershed are known. Do you have anything to add there? Do you have any other information?
I suspect there's a lot of mines, closed mines in the province, many of them 100 years old, that we wouldn't be aware of them all.
Is it possible that they would be discharging into the water system?
Possible. We do know of several that have become concerns that we've dealt with.
Okay. And how do you deal with those mines then that are closed or abandoned and are of concern?
If they're orphan mines, which means that there's no longer a company that has liability for the mine, then we would have to carry that all out by the government. If there's still a mining company associated with that mine, then we can approach them to correct matters, do more monitoring, whatever.
Mr. Hagan also talked about Highland Valley Copper. Have you been to that mine site?
Many times.
And is it the case that there's no discharge?
I guess it depends on your definition of what is a discharge, and Mike would be the expert as far as the MMER goes. There are several areas of the mine. It's basically an amalgamation of 4 historical mines, and some of the mining areas are now closed, and they have discharges of seepage. There's no discharge from the tailings pond directly, but there are seepage collection systems below the tailings ponds that are allowed to discharge to the environment, both at the Highmont tailings pond site and the Bethlehem site. But neither of those mining areas are operational. Well, I take it back. The Highmont was closed, but with the increase in copper and moly prices, they actually reopened the 2 open pits at Highmont. And first they drained them. They were actually making them fishery lakes. And so they drained them, took out the rainbow trout and transplanted them to other water bodies and remined the system. So the mine pits themselves are active, but all the milling and tailings pond are in the existing Highland Valley Copper Mill.
Again, and are there discharges from that?
There are, again, some seepage is allowed to discharge to the Witches Brook and to Dupuy Creek. The issue there was that, the mine would probably like to collect all that water because it is a water short area, but what that means is then you basically dry up your stream and cause aquatic habitat loss. So we're trying to ensure that relatively good quality water is allowed to go down into that system and maintain flows, maintain the fishery that's in there, or the fish that are in there, as well as the moose habitat, wetlands, etc.
Are the fish that's in that creek sockeye salmon?
No. Okay. There's a fish barrier many kilometers downstream.
Okay. And I guess this question is for Mr. Hill. Does the province have a standard set of parameters, like we were looking at with the federal regulations, that are monitored for every mill or mine, or are they determined on a site-specific basis?
The monitoring parameters are determined on a site-specific basis.
And how do you ensure consistency of environmental protection when you do that on a site-specific basis? How do you know you've identified and set the right limits to protect the environment?
Well, the monitoring parameters would generally be broader than just the ones that are regulated. As was mentioned earlier, when you get metals done, you get the entire suite of metals that the lab is able to produce. And then the environmental effects monitoring, and biological monitoring, toxicity testing would also help to identify if there was some other parameters that might be causing a concern.
Do you work with the Environment Canada representatives to determine the parameters for the site?
When an application is made to us, it has been referred to Environment Canada for their input, and if they had some specific additional parameters that they would want to see included in a permit, that would be expected to be a part of the application, and we would include that in the permit.
And Mr. Grace, are the provincial biologists like yourself involved in determining parameters in the permits?
Yes, that's one of our main jobs when we assess a permit application.
And what information do you use in providing that advice?
Generally, it would, maybe I should step back a bit. If it's a new mine, it would first have to undergo the environmental assessment process. And as part of that, there would be a fairly substantial environmental impact study done before the mine actually is developed. Using that data plus data that the mine would provide on predicting metal levels in any effluents or seepage, we can use that to assess potential impacts from those. And it would also identify metals of concern and other parameters such as if they use process chemicals, we may want to monitor that as well.
What's done with respect to endocrine disrupting chemicals from pulp mills?
Specifically with endocrine disrupting compounds, it's not really been something that we've addressed much before. I mean, certainly if they're a metal, then they're caught up in the metal sampling.
And if they're not a metal?
I don't think it's been addressed up till now.
If a biologist finds a concern in the monitoring data, can recommended changes be made to the permit? Can they recommend changes to the permit?
Yes, definitely. We assess the reports that are submitted by the mines and their consultants. And as a result of that, if there's an issue of, some metal that we think's a problem, we could add it, change the monitoring program, or alter the permit limits for the discharge, both up, either increasing or decreasing.
And has that actually happened?
Many times.
What do you do to assess the effectiveness of the permit conditions? We've heard about the environmental effects monitoring that the federal regulatory program is doing. Do you have a similar program in BC?
Our environmental effects monitoring programs are very site-specific. There is some general talk between all the various environmental impacts assessment biologists, but especially with mines, there's a lot of complexity and variability in their impacts. The type of ore they're mining, the type of waste rock that they may be in, the type of mill process, and the environment itself can be very different. You could be in a headwater stream in alpine area, or you could be in a valley bottom where there's, discharge might be to something quite large. There's also some areas where hardness is very low, or in our area, hardness tends to be relatively high. That can impact the impact of, I guess I got to use it twice. That could alter the impact of the metals. They tend to be less toxic with higher hardness.
So it's done on a site-specific basis. Is there a process similar to what we heard about as an investigation of cause process that we heard with the federal regulations? Or do you have this reference site and exposed site comparison concept?
Okay. Yes, we typically try and set up our systems. I mean, environmental effects monitoring is pretty much standard. The best situation is an upstream-downstream situation. If that's not possible, then you would look at finding a nearby reference site that's as close as possible to what you think upstream site would be. The other thing, which is also much better, is if you can get a before disturbance and an after disturbance situation, which is called BACI, which is before after control impact type of monitoring program. And that way, if there is a difference between your control and your impact site, you can compare that to the before mine situation, where maybe that was something naturally that was occurring and not a part of the mine, or conversely, the two sites upstream and downstream were very similar before the mine, and now there's a difference. So it makes your assessment much more clear and easier to identify issues.
How many mines on the Fraser would have, would there be that would give you that ability where you'd have data to say this is what it looked like before and this is what it looks like now?
Well, Highland Valley Copper was developed in the mid-60s, so that was before our group was even around. So we don't have a lot of pre-discharge data there. The more recent mines, we do get a lot of pre-discharge monitoring, used typically as part of the Environmental Assessment Act process, or even just under exploration. We have several well-developed exploration areas that we actually have permits for, because they have open pits and mine adits, and then have a discharge. So I guess that could be considered a post-mine monitoring, but often the mines now will start monitoring even before they come and talk to us, because they know they have to.
Right.
We'll take the break, Ms. Mayor.
Mr. Commissioner, would we be able to come back a little bit early before 2 today?
I'll aim for 10:02. I don't know if I can make that, but I'll aim for that.
Okay, thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned till 1:50.